Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. I see lots of students I recognize. Thank you for coming. As Stephen said, there's not a check-in, there's a check-out, so there'll be a table over here. This table over here will be used for signing in for your particular course that you're taking for the semester. My name is Jim Smither, and I'm an associate professor in the Urban and Regional Studies and Planning program here at VCU. We're going to start off with a couple of remarks from Waller School Dean Dr. Susan Gooden and Dr. Jimmy Chin, our program chair. Jimmy, would you come up now and get us started off?
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jimmy Chen, the Program Chair of Urban Regional Study Program at Wiley Schools. I would like to welcome all of you to join this signature event, the annual event, to hold the memory of commemorate the Professor Morton Gulak. Okay, Morton Gulak. On these important occasions, too many people I want to thank. First of all, I want to thank Virginia Housing for their generous financial sponsorship, and hopefully they will continue to support our signature program next year. Thanks, Virginia Housing. And also I would like to thank the Gulak families, and including the late Paula Gulak and Lauren Gulak and the entire family. Thank you so much, Lauren, you represented the family. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm also very thankful for the leadership of the Dean's Office, in particular Dean Susan Godens and the Senior Associate Dean Jada Berrigens, and our communications, events, and development teams, in particular Katie Coons, David Slifers, Stephen Dozes, and Tiffany Robertson. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge my all faculty colleagues, in particular Professor Jim Smith, for organizing this important event. Jim, thank you so much. Thank you so much. As I said, this is a signature event. Each year, we bring together the leading planners, architects, and urban designers from the regions to join this event. And this is an annual event. We started this event in 2013 to commemorate late Professor Morton Gulak, who co-founded this urban regional planning program in 1973. So this is already been 50 years. Not too long ago, we celebrate the 50 years anniversary of the founding of our programs. And Professor Gulak joined the faculty of VCU in 1972. And he taught at the VCU for 38 years, and he counted for the programs, and he trained, educated hundreds of thousands of students in urban plannings, urban designs, urban revitalizations, physical planning, etc. And we miss, I personally, because I worked with Professor Gulak for 3 years, and I still vividly remember those days, okay, in 2007. For example, when I was interviewed for these faculty positions, he picked me up from the Linden Road Inn. I still remember that. That's in the February 2007. And we also supervised student togethers, because at that time, he also coordinated the Studio 2 programs, architectural programs, work together. And I personally, and the entire program, we sorely miss Professor Gulak, missing a lot. Okay, missing a lot. And next, I want to briefly introduce my program. Some of you may already know, some of you may not know, because this program was founded in 1973, and the American Planning Association recognized the program dating back to 1977, and since 1982, this program has been continuously accredited by the Planning Accreditation Board. And we won the 2 consecutive 7-year accreditation. Most recently in year 2021, our program has been accredited by PAB for the second 7-year programs. And currently the program, we have 11 full-time faculty members plus dozens of adjunct faculty members, and they are doing the high impact research in housing, affordable housing, efficient labs, social equities, energy, environmental planning, transportation, sustainability, and geospatial analysis, such as. And the program is in great shape. And these are the current full-time faculty members of my program, 11 faculty members. We also have dozens of adjunct full-time faculty. So altogether, we have more than 20 faculty members in totals. And during the past 2 decades, four faculty colleagues led this program before me. And I want to acknowledge all of them, Professor John Acodino, Professor Ivan Sun, and Professor Megan Goff, and Professor Damien Pitt. Thank you so much for your leadership, past leadership. With these brief introductions, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce the Dean of the Wiley Schools, Professor Susan Golden. She's also professor of Public Administration Program and also internationally renowned expert in social equity. Please welcome Dean Golden. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen, and welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you join us tonight for the Gulak Lecture. This is certainly a signature event in the Wilder School that we are most proud of. I would also like to echo the thanks that has been provided. I first want to give my deep thanks and appreciation to the Gulak family. Lauren, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. It's been great. We really appreciate the family support in endowing this scholarship, this lectureship series, but we also appreciate the fact that you, year in and year out, the family provides their support with their presence here as well. So thank you so very much. That means the world to us. I also want to join in supporting Virginia Housing for their generous sponsorship of this event, and to thank Jimmy Chin and Jim Smither for their excellent leadership of this, as well as the program committee and all the folks who are involved in this excellent lecture. I also want to share kudos about the MERP program, the Masters in Urban and Regional Planning program. One of the things that Professor Jin said was that it's 51 years old, and that is true, but there was a big celebration last year for the 50th anniversary. And so it was great there to acknowledge everyone who has been such a big part of the MERP program success, current faculty members, former faculty members, alumni. So I want to ask faculty members, if you can please stand, MERP faculty members, I want to recognize them. Let's give them a round of applause. And I know we have some alumni out there as well, so can we get our alumni to stand? Thank you. The success of our program and the success of the Wilder School really is anchored in the foundational support that we have in our outstanding faculty, as well as our outstanding alumni who continue to offer internship opportunities for our students, job opportunities and consultation for them. This truly is a team-based effort. And then also, I just want to encourage everyone, we have another big event coming up in April, and that's our Excellence in Virginia Government Awards Luncheon. That's a signature event where we recognize excellence in, oops. Oh, no, you're good? Oh, I can do that? No. Oh, thanks. Where we recognize excellence, and so please join us on April the 8th. We will be giving out a lot of awards at that time, recognizing people who have done excellent work in public service throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's guest speaker. I do want to say about Professor Gulak that Professor Gulak, I had the opportunity to interact with him when I first joined the Wilder School in 2004. And, you know, many warm conversations. Our offices were on the same floor for a number of years. And to see the level of investment that Dr. Gulak put into his students, always had time for a conversation, always had time to really connect with students and to provide advice and excellent advice. And so those types of things that you can't quantify by class hours or anything like that, but always having his door on open hinges. And he and Paula both, in terms of always welcoming students into their home as well. So that they set a high bar for all of us in terms of what it means to be an engaged member of the faculty and to invest and be very generous in terms of our time commitment with our students. And so tonight, I'm delighted to introduce the keynote speaker for tonight's event, who is Victor Dover. And he's going to be talking about car-optional neighborhoods for the new era. Victor is an urban designer and town planner whose work spans 22 states and 5 continents. Wow, that's expansive. He is known for the designs of Glenwood Park in Atlanta, Georgia, South Main in Buena Vista, Colorado, Eon in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, as well as the downtown plans for many cities, including Richmond, Virginia. I was talking to Jim before this and found out that he was involved in planning the city of Richmond in 2005, which ironically also overlaps with when the namesake of our school, Governor Wilder, was then mayor of the city of Richmond. So he has long ties and strong ties to the Wilder School, which we appreciate. He co-authored Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns, the leading textbook on the subject, and he has been awarded both the John Nolen Medal for contributions to urbanism and the Seaside Prize in 2024. So I'm delighted to give a warm welcome. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dover. Thank you for being here.
Wow, that was very nice. We're all Americans, so we're a little suspicious of growth and change. We're hardwired to be suspicious of growth and change. Have you ever wondered why it seems like we get this much economic progress and population growth, but we get that much traffic congestion? Or at least it feels that way, right? Why is that? How did that happen? First, let's look at how we got to where we are.
We're running out of roads. We didn't dream big enough.
This is Agony Alley. Morning rush and evening wait. Fight your way home from work. You think you got it made. Good job, car nearly paid for. So you get a little home in the suburbs, away from the city smoke, out from the shadows of the factory, into the sun and clean air. Raise a few kids, some flowers and vegetables. The big dream coming true. But it backfires into a pipe dream. Exhaust pipe dream. Every night it takes longer to get home, wasting more time in gasoline. No wonder everybody's acting so nervous. What's a citizen gonna do?
What can a citizen do? Our American dream of Futurama on wheels can come true. Our highway engineers know the way. It's ours for the asking, if we'll ask and pay our way. Freedom of the road is as old as the first man and as new as this moment. Once we fought for it, through forest and river, wild animals and Indians, across desert and mountain range, and we won our right of way. Now there is another payment to be made on our freedom of movement. It's the price for growing greater than our biggest dream. Today, 2 miles of highway are wearing out for every one being built. And tomorrow, we'll have 1 million more drivers, not counting those in the back seat. The way ahead, is it to be a dead end or the green light?
Don't honk your horn. Raise your voice. Ask for better highways and more parking space. It's your country. To get the green light, write your state capital. Write Washington, D.C. Write your hometown officials. Postcard your newspaper editor. Call your radio and TV commentators. Support your highway officials. And when you vote, vote for your right of way. Don't honk your horn.
Raise your voice. It's your country. Give yourself the green light.
Give yourself the green light. We are so accustomed to the idea that driving everywhere for everything, every time, is the way you're supposed to do it. And we are so accustomed to the idea that if you're not driving everywhere for everything, every time, you're doing it wrong. And we are so accustomed to the idea that wider and faster roads are better roads, we forget that that whole way of thinking is a product of skillful propaganda. The film I just showed you played as a newsreel in movie theaters all across America on the eve of the adoption of the Interstate Highway Act in 1955. It was produced by the most skillful propagandists in practice at that time, the Jam Handy Productions team, on behalf of General Motors, exactly. So as it turns out, there was a real big lie in all that, which is that we could somehow build our way out of the problems. Did you catch the line, Lauren, when the narrator says, very ominously, right now 2 miles are wearing out for every mile of road being built? That means that 1/3 of the country was under construction simultaneously while he made that quote, and it sounded so terrible, but of course that was the great disruption. So I am going to show you examples from around the country and abroad. I'm going to show you some samples of different ways of thinking. I'm going to talk a bit about street design, which I have come to feel is the most important thing in this, in the pursuit of a better way of making things. You'll notice that I've adopted the phrase car optional. I do promise for those who are interested to show a couple car-free communities because they do exist. But I wanted to make clear that I am not, Victor Dover is not, a car-hating horse and buggy planner. I did get introduced that way by an angry NIMBY in Montgomery, Alabama one time. That Dover, he's not a pedestrian lover. He's a car-hating horse and buggy planner. But I'm not. I own a car. I like to drive. It's a nice German car. And I wish that when I want to use it, all of you suckers weren't in the lane I'm trying to use, right at the intersection I'm trying to get through, right when I'm trying to get there. And you know, we all felt that way, right? But it turns out that life is better when we don't have to use them as much, or we don't need one for every person, or we don't need every trip to be a long trip. So I'm going to talk a bit about how that all looks. Now, by way of introduction, I want to say I think that those of you who are studying physical planning with Jim Smither are already aware we are, as planners, in the before and after business. But what we do is we draw pictures of the way things are, and then we alter them before and after to imagine how they might be changed into something we would rather have, or something that might turn out to be a little less economically brittle. And by the way, that sketch, that's the Jamestown Mall in St. Louis. And that's the Sears. Anybody remember Sears? And the Sears Auto Center, also on that picture. And we made this beautiful watercolor based on helicopter photographs before drones were common. And that picture depicts every car in the parking lot on the day that we shot the base photograph. So what we were trying to illustrate was another way of building cities that might turn out to engender more loyalty among a fickle public, especially when it comes to retailing. But the biggest goal we have, and I would say this goal should be shared by all the students in the Master of Real Estate Development program as well, is restoring public confidence in the idea of growth and change. That it might actually be possible to grow our way out of problems and to have growth and change result in the world being better instead of worse. And that means we have to learn to draw it. We have to actually draw denser cities that are more livable cities, that where people are living closer together in a more fiscally supportable way and can afford to do it, and in a more climate responsible way, but they love the town even more, and the town is even more charming because of that growth and change. We also have to learn how to do some basic things, like take control of our rights of way as the narrator said in the video clip. And imagine using that publicly owned real estate more creatively and for more than one thing. Now, when it comes to traffic, that falsehood that wider and better roads are better roads really does come from skillful propagandists. And that headline happens to be from the part of the world where I live in South Florida. But you can see this everywhere you go. And people are frustrated because when you're driving in a car, it feels like the natural thing would be to flow. I mean, who wouldn't want to flow? Flow feels like what you ought to do. It's so easy to go faster in a modern car that the cities that were built around even Model Ts in the 1920s, which topped out at about 22 miles an hour, turn out to be frustrating for us as car-brained motorists. That free-flowing condition we might crave as motorists isn't actually even achievable. And that's because of induced demand, which I'll talk about a little bit, and the sheer amount of space that we take up in individual cars. It's already too hard to drive. When you're stuck in traffic, just remember there are too many other people trying to use the same lane you're trying to use right when you're trying to do it. Too many people trying to use the same space the same way at the same time. But trying to widen our way out of traffic congestion is an exercise in futility. And this is what happens as you metastasize the system on that underlying assumption that in the future everyone would and should drive everywhere for everything every time. The worlds of transportation engineering and city planning in particular and infrastructure funding were all retooled around that assumption around the time of the propaganda film that I showed you. Now, fast forward to more recently, it turns out that building more capacity didn't actually solve the problem. It created an avenue for latent demand or induced demand to fill up the roadway before it was even finished. So this dogged pursuit of a futile goal has ended up causing a lot of problems. It's, of course, divided cities. I would argue we're in one with the impact of 95 through the city. It decimated neighborhoods, in many places the neighborhoods of the most vulnerable with the least clout. It emptied out the public treasury, so this is a little bit of a problem. If they were given that it's going to cost a lot more to rebuild things as our highway infrastructure as it ages than it cost to build them in the first place. And worst of all, it created an unprecedented public safety crisis. Lots of people dying. In fact, the headlines got bad during COVID because during the lockdown, a lot of people stayed home. There was a lot less traffic on the streets, and there were brief moments of calm and peace and nonviolence in our streets because the traffic, everybody was staying home. But once drivers started returning to the roadways with fewer of the rest of us competing for space with them, they started driving faster. All that extra asphalt that was widened to try and keep up with the flow demand at peak hour actually turned out to be an invitation to higher speeds. And with higher speeds come more fatalities. You probably guessed this already, but we've long since broken 2021's record. We're now up to about 44,000 people a year in this country, which is an unbelievable number of deaths to have happen without any public alarm. If we had this number of people dying in terrorist attacks or even from a great many major diseases, we would be upset about it. This turns out that dying in traffic is one of the top ways of dying for Americans under 25 as well. And it isn't just a Virginia thing, although it is a Virginia thing, 24% in the last decade. It's a California thing and a thing everywhere in between. Now, some of the harmed are vulnerable road users on the outside of vehicles. After all, the people inside cars have seat belts and airbags and crumple zones and side air curtains and unibody construction in case the car rolls and all that stuff. But those of us, those squishy traffic calming devices we call pedestrians that are on the outside of the cars are very vulnerable. Same for people on bikes. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we might improve upon that. Okay, as if all of that wasn't bad enough, the cars take up too much space. And here's why trying to widen our way out of congestion will never, ever work. The amount of space it takes for 400 of us to drive alone in our cars is immense. And of course, the faster we are moving, the farther apart we have to be. You learned that in driver's ed, right? And they take even more space. But compare that to the amount of space it would take for the same number of people moving around the city in buses or even on one train, not much. Now, electronic stuff like the electrification of the vehicles themselves, which will help with air quality, and autonomous vehicles. I'm actually very excited about autonomous connected vehicles. We can talk about that if you like. Car sharing apps, all these things that are happening with the gadgets are actually great, but they won't save us from the fundamental problem that cars take up too much space, whether we're driving them or we're storing them. We drive too much. And when we park them, which we do, our cars are still motionless 94% of the time. 94% of the time, the cars are just sitting still. Now, if you live in the suburbs and you have a double-wide garage door on the front of your house, that's designed so that a whole giant piece of the wall of your house can magically rise when you press a button on your dashboard, and then you can take the vehicle, the appliance that we all love, and pull it all the way inside the building as close to your bed as possible, which is just amazing. Isn't that a little bit like this? Like we keep these appliances with us, right? Because we're devoted to them. And somehow the same thing happened with the design of the typical suburban house. So I was in Atlanta and I was looking out the window of the Westin Hotel and I just to see what was there. And I started realizing that almost everything I could see was parking. That's parking. Actually, that's not completely accurate. I showed this picture in Atlanta, and one of the people in an audience like this one jumped up and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Victor, that's not right at all. That gray one in the middle there, that's also parking." So as it turns out, if we could get past this need to drive so much and store our cars so much in these locations, then we would release a lot of urban land for other purposes, including abundant housing, more green space. We'd also create a tremendous disruption in urban commercial real estate. You remember the law of supply and demand from the Econ 101 class, where they told you that surplus drives prices down and scarcity drives prices up? Well, if all of a sudden a huge percentage of our urban land goes from having at least an ostensible value and amortization schedule to having little or no value, you will witness a tremendous, if temporary, drop in real estate values, which could be a big deal. Also, I'm saying we need to drive less, planets getting choked on all the stuff coming out of our tailpipes, and it's bad for our bodies and bad for our brains, and we're killing each other. We got to drive less. But I also want to point out that the number one occupation for adult American males is driving in one form or another. Driving a bus or driving a truck or driving an Amazon truck or driving an Uber. But that's the number one occupation. So as enthusiastic as I am about autonomous vehicles, don't expect that transition to come without enormous disruption. It's believed that because we have to maintain those vehicles and we have to modify them and keep up with the batteries on them and all this kind of stuff, that the autonomous and connected vehicle movement will create something like 30 million new jobs in the foreseeable future. But it might actually destroy about 17 million jobs almost overnight in the process first. So that could turn out to be problematic. So I'm not suggesting that gadgets are going to save us. In fact, it might be a little awkward at times as we adapt to living with them. What I am suggesting is that there's another way of thinking about our cities that could simultaneously make us happier and healthier and also make our real estate more valuable, make our cities more efficient to deliver municipal services, and help us build our way out of the problems. And that way is building towns in a way that builds places where people want to be. And if they drove, they can drive and park once instead of having to park once and again a second time and a third time and a 17th time all over town. They might be able to make a few car trips per day per household, not 13 or 14 car trips per day per household on average. And that way is street-oriented urbanism. So as I go along here, I'll share some experiences from our practice. Before and after thinking is a a tool we'll have to use to do what I just described. Here's an oldie but goodie. This was the first street design that we did in 1992. And I call it the little street in South Miami that gave us permission to get out of South Miami every once in a while because it was the first road diet in Florida where the big fat road was skinnied up and more space returned to things like walking and outdoor dining and trees. It turned out to get a lot of attention. So I've had the privilege since to roam all over the country doing pep rallies like this one about better ways of building cities. For the students, if you haven't already grasped this from Jim's class, the built environment doesn't just happen by accident. We don't get the city that we have from Santa Claus or from the Easter Bunny. It happens as a direct result of regulation and design, like decisions people make, not necessarily consciously every time, and even in regulation, not necessarily with regulations that people will remember who wrote them or why they wrote them that way. But it definitely comes about as a result of that. And it can be for ill, like in this case, the embodiment of minimum parking requirements. Richmond should give itself a round of applause for repealing and just doing away with minimum parking requirements, one of the worst things that ever happened. Getting rid of it in Richmond, the right move. Now, when the built environment is pleasing or satisfying or feels good to be in, that's also generally a result of people drawing lines on a map and making rules in a book and then following that plan. Let me show you an example of how this works. So this is in London. These fellows are standing on the same block where the BBC headquarters is. So this is a busy part of town, vehicles swirling all around, thousands of people around. But what we see in a picture like that is things like how far back from the public right-of-way are the buildings situated? And how tall are they? How dense in dwelling units per acre? How much square footage is built? That's the intensity. What's in these buildings? What is the activity that's taking place? This land use, all very tightly regulated. Of course, parking requirements I already mentioned. What about where there's glass and where there's not? Like how much transparency exists on that ground floor when you're walking by? And then, a subtle topic, architecture matters. A lot of it has to do with what kind of architecture we build. And yes, the manuals that control how engineers set up the space between the buildings. Now, in that particular street, I love this example because that guy's heels are about 8 inches away from the curb. He's not at all fearful. He's exchanging ideas with a colleague. Maybe they're just deciding where to go to lunch. But when the car turns this corner and goes down that street, they're going to slow down. They're going to step up on that speed table, and they're going to slowly go across it at the crosswalk, and they're going to go back down again. And so the result is that the design forces the movement of the vehicles to be slow. Or on the other hand, human habitat? Does that look like if a wildlife biologist was just asked to observe the species in the wild that are evident in this location? They would say human? Maybe not. Where I live, there's a controversial road segment where people are constantly clamoring for more capacity. They want more road or more bridges or more ways to go because it's jammed up every day at peak hour. So I was actually curious about it. I went out there and I stood on the side of the road while we were flying a drone to get that photograph, and I just looked through the windows of each car as it went by. One person per car, because that's the way this low-density suburb was set up. It was spread out. It was far from the workplaces, and with not very many connections. So everybody that had to make that movement had to use the same road. Now, this is not the fact that that's not sustainable isn't news. In fact, it's meant to be part of an ever-continuing spiral of continuous happiness. Let me describe it for you. This is according to the trade magazine called Asphalt Bulletin in 1966. And I know the letters are a little small, so I'm going to read it. The first one says, deep strength asphalt pavement provides more paved roads for fewer tax dollars. Sounds pretty good, right? Number 2, more paved roads stimulates travel. You see, that's not a new discovery. They knew that. It boosts road fuel use. Sorry, planet. We just had to do it. And it provides more road tax revenue. You know, government can grow larger and spend more money on this. Number 3, more road tax revenue means more dollars to maintain and build extra paved roads. The ones we don't really need yet, the ones that are extra, the surplus ones. And then last, more improved roads ease traffic congestion and develop even more travel. Well, that part didn't actually occur. The more travel, yes, the road congestion getting eased, not so much. So when this was the propaganda that was circulating through industry and through our technical professions and through our lawmakers' minds, we were asking ourselves the wrong questions. The wrong question is, how can we solve the plight of the person who insists on driving long distances alone? Now, there are a lot of us that are in that category from time to time. In fact, if I'm in that category because I really need to get across town because there's an emergency or I really need the ambulance to get to the hospital, I'm not going to apologize for being in a vehicle to do it, but I am going to wish fewer of you were in the way. You get it? Okay. Now, that question has a corollary that says, how can we satisfy the person who insists on driving alone no matter the cost in lives or dollars? That's the question that's been asked by the transpocracy since Futurama on Wheels was first pitched in the 1939 World's Fair. Another way to say it is, how can we keep more and more car traffic moving each year at all costs? The engineers use a background traffic growth projection in every transportation impact analysis to forecast the future congestion or level of service on your street after development occurs. And then they'll just put in a percentage that, you know, the amount of people driving and the amount of driving that goes on, the amount of vehicle miles traveled per person is going to go up. So we'll just put in a 2% or a 3%. They call it growth factor. But that's enough to cause you to come out at the end of a long computerized analysis with the answer, I need a wider road because the computer made me do it. What's the right question? Or at least a better question. How can we get all of the economic progress we want and support a growing population in our cities that have reversed what 25 years ago was Richmond's shrinking city condition? And at the same time, reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled per person per year. Now, there are several ways to do that. One of them is to try to get a larger percentage of trips to occur by walking, biking, and transit. So if you're a frustrated motorist who's looking over there at that bike lane, wishing that space hadn't been cordoned off for somebody else, remember that every time somebody is opting to take a walk or a bike ride or a short trip in a car or a transit trip, they're your new best friend because they're getting out of the way. I don't think we put enough emphasis on trip shortening. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. One of the ways we can get trips to be shorter is to mix land uses. And in our traditional cities, that's exactly what we always did. For about 10,000 years since Jericho was founded, humans in Jericho for 10,000 years, at least the last 3,500 years or so, it's been our custom to mix land uses within the city. Why did we do that? I mean, at least up until the 1950s and 60s when we got going with the suburban sprawl separating of uses experiment. Why do we mix the uses? Because the city was invented to minimize the need for travel. That's what a city's for. David Engwich is the first to have articulated this. A city was invented, perhaps, and Professor Glaser calls it humankind's greatest invention, so that we could exchange ideas and have transactions and get together with one another and find a mate and all these other things we do as humans without having to travel so darn far to do it on a camel or a horse or what have you. So a street like this one, which is Park Avenue in Winter Park, that was the second street we got to design, was designed to support this idea of mixing land uses. That a main street with its apartments and offices upstairs or hotel rooms upstairs and storefronts downstairs with stores and restaurants is an embodiment of the idea of mixed use. And they actually built new buildings, not just restoring the old ones, that carried out that idea. So mixing uses is very powerful. It's good for our brains, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well, but it's also good for our bodies. We move around and burn calories instead of fossil fuels. That's pretty useful. Now, this fellow on the right is a greengrocer in Bologna, in Italy. And so somebody who lives on the block we see in the distance, on the upstairs apartment, can come down onto that street and walk over to this corner and say good morning to him and get fresh fruits and vegetables on that intersection without having to make a car trip. And they've been able to do that at that exact spot and that exact intersection for the last 600 years. Imagine how many pounds of fossil fuel into the atmosphere, how many car trips were eliminated by the need to do that. Now, building more compact places to minimize travel means living closer together, and that will take many forms. It looks different depending on where you are. Each place strives for creating its own local distinctiveness, which Richmond, of course, has in spades. So in Oklahoma City, when they got to work on building on a big infill opportunity site in the center of town, they reintroduced these same ideas in a neighborhood called the Wheeler District, where there's mixed use, there's a brewery. That was the first non-residential component. I thought that was brilliant. Form follows beer, right? But they also set out, right in front of the brewery here, to make this a kid-friendly place. And they were doing it on purpose because they saw a great unmet need in the market for young families and starter households. So the houses are small, they're very close together, they don't have all the square footage somebody might want someday in their life. And the streets themselves are also small. This is the first street built in the Wheeler District. It's called Peddler's Lane. Not like the peddler who sells you something, like the pedaler who rides a bike. So they were deliberately talking to the younger people who get this need. This was a real headline. I didn't make this up. It just might be that simple joy of being able to walk out of your townhouse or your apartment or your house or your office and walk down the street and get a cup of coffee is the basic fundamental thing we have to satisfy. It's way more important than how many parking spaces per square foot you add in the building. So all across the country, people are doing things, not necessarily all at once in the same places, to start to turn this back into environments where walking, biking, and transit are viable. In El Paso, for example, they restored the historic streetcars and put them back to work on the corridor that connects downtown with the university. And now a lot of trips that used to happen on that corridor in cars are occurring in transit vehicles instead. And very interesting, if you look in the lower right, in 2010, that historic building was just derelict and a mess. And they had basically run out of gas with their local historic preservation movement. That historic preservation, which was big once in El Paso, like it's been big for a long time in Richmond, had lost energy because it seemed like a regulatory function. Like basically the police are telling you you have to delay the demolition of your building, and the design Gestapo, design police are telling you how you can and can't design the renovation and so on. So what they did around 2010 was move historic preservation from being a regulatory function to being an economic development function. Because we began to see that people who were considering using this corridor for walking or biking or transit would be a whole lot more likely to do it if the historic buildings were restored and there was life on the street, eyes on the street. So they weren't the first to do this. Obviously, Richmond's done a whole lot of it, and Chocolate Bottom and other places. Our neighbors in Chattanooga are interesting to look at. In Chattanooga in the 1970s was reviled and criticized in the national press. The dirtiest little city in America, they said. A Rust Belt economy in a Sun Belt location. Those are real headlines. And so, I don't know how it would work here. I don't know the current administration like I did know Mayor Wilder, but in a lot of towns where we've worked, the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce president would immediately call a press conference to deny something like that. No, we're not the dirtiest little city in America. We're the third dirtiest little city, darn it. And so that's not very good. But that's not what they did in Chattanooga. actually said, let's get our act together and do something about it. And they had a friend in the Senate with Senator Gore, so federal support was found to help them do it. They cleaned up their riverfront, they revitalized their downtown, they added electrified transit when there was no one in America had such a thing on buses. And they really kind of turned Chattanooga around. If you haven't been there, it's quite the story of a dramatic turnaround. But the area that you see in the little green rectangle there, that's the south side, south of the tracks, the other side of the tracks. And that area was surrounded by highways, like a big concrete dog collar going around the neck of the neighborhood. And it had been hit by all kinds of problems. Industrial jobs that were in the south side had left. The conditions were pretty dire. So these are late 90s photographs of the area in the south side. There's actually a street called Main Street. And on Main Street, every building, pause for emphasis, every building was boarded up. Not 90% of them, every single one, all the way down Main Street was empty. And so the combination of urban renewal and white flight and industrial offshoring and urban and highway building, everything that could have happened to undercut a neighborhood's success happened to the south side. There are actually 3 neighborhoods here. There's Rustville, that's really the name, hence the south side rebranding. Fort Negley, which everybody called Fort Neglect, and Jefferson Heights, those 3 neighborhoods. And so it was kind of a smoldering ruin. They did a plan for street-oriented urbanism. And they didn't try to do everything at once. First thing they did was just connect 17th Street, which is in the middle of this picture, and get a school. They suddenly realized that a few hundred steps away, there were 4,500 employees at the Tennessee Valley Authority headquarters, all of whom might be candidates for living in the neighborhood or having their kids go to school in the neighborhood, so they would be close to to their workplaces. And with those facts in mind, they started working on it. They didn't start with Main Street at first, conspicuously. So here's a late 90s aerial photograph, and then this is an early 2000s aerial photograph. You see 17th Street built through and so on. And what did they do? They built real street-like streets with sidewalks and street trees and front porches facing the street. And just for good measure, and make sure nobody drove fast, put a little square at the end of the block so that you had to slow down and go around it. There's a thing in the road and slow it down. It's an architecture school town, so you'll appreciate there are primary colors here and there. And after a while, after that first street started to look like a place again, they turned their attention to the historic buildings and to the main street and recruited restaurants. The artists and the bike shops, the artists, bike shops, and preservationists. These are the shock troops of urban revitalization. The artists kind of went in and started climbing around in all those rusty buildings and pulled out all this rusty stuff and started making art out of it, including the garden walls and fences, which by themselves are an attraction now. Here's one of the derelict buildings seen in 1999, and now it's the best restaurant in Chattanooga. And it's very interesting to see what they've done. Now, every few days, there's another headline about a corporation that wants to be in the South Side, or another hotel opening in the South Side, or more housing being built in the South Side. It's no longer thought of as the unsuccessful other side of the tracks, quite the opposite. When we got to work in Richmond in 2005, I feel good about a couple of things we got to do. And it was thanks to a lot of really intense meetings in Mayor Wilder's office at that time. For one, we said the map should include Manchester, that Manchester and downtown on opposite sides of the James frame the river as your great wet central park. Nobody else has this. Nobody has class 3 or class 4 rapids in their downtown. You have that. And Mayo Island should be public space and a few other things like that. There was an idea for Hull Street, which I know Hull Street is very different today than it was in 2005. I don't think we're all the way to the vision seen in the 100-year plan, but maybe the stage has been set. So I have high hopes for Richmond. especially pleased that VCU had me come back, because some of those intense meetings were VCU administration executives yelling at me for suggesting we might preserve the West Hospital and that we might make building to street relationships again between the campus buildings and the streets they face. I'm sticking to those positions, by the way. The controversy died down. We just took the bold type off of some of the sentences in the plan, and they said, okay, then you can do it. Let's look at what they've been doing in Oakland, California. You know, in the beginning, in Oakland, the challenge for a new downtown specific plan was how do we streamline the process for approvals so that each individual development doesn't have to go through a terrible 7-year process under the regulatory rigmarole, and how do we better integrate land use and transportation and urban design? Those sound like pretty legit topics. I thought that was pretty good, but that wasn't nearly enough, because Oakland was asking bigger questions. They were asking, how can we have a plan for growing and accommodating our fair share of housing and jobs in the Bay Area, and turning the lights back on in some of our historic buildings, or doing the seismic retrofits in expensive historic buildings, and still end up with a place that's more equitable and shared by all and still creative, because Oakland wanted to stay a creative place. So anyway, it's an interesting little sequence to see the imagination of what was already in the pipeline plus what was likely in the near future and thereafter. It became a very physical drawing, underwent a lot of scrutiny and examination from different angles to build the plan in an intense public process. I highlight that little spot in the yellow rectangle because that's Interstate 980. There's a terrible gash in Oakland that was built like a moat to divide historically African American West Oakland from the downtown with its shiny Chamber of Commerce towers and so on. It wasn't really a highway they actually needed, please note, and it isn't even used that much compared to the other big corridors. So the plan for downtown Oakland suggests we should get rid of it and replace it with an at-grade boulevard, real streets that really reconnect West Oakland and downtown, and in the process free up publicly owned land for mixed income housing and green space. So I would encourage you to look it up and send us your critique of the downtown Oakland plan. But instead of being just another land use and transportation plan, it's really a plan that's fundamentally about equity. And just to zoom in on a couple of examples of what I mean, each policy is put through a filter and examination with regard to its equity impacts and on minority and vulnerable populations in particular. There's a frank, a very candid, blunt description of the history of racial disparities in Oakland in the basic background information at the front of the book. Most local governments don't adopt that. They like to pretend that never happened. But Oakland, like a lot of other cities, was harmed by the period of Jim Crow and the American apartheid, and the plan really is about fixing it. Now, it still is about land use and transportation, but it's also about culture keeping. And just to jump ahead to 980 here, here's the trench I described to you. Downtown at the top and West Oakland on the bottom of the slide. And what if, before and after thinking, we were to fix that and undo the harm? Why not, would be my thinking. But now, Oakland, as the city, had to go first. This couldn't exist in any California Transportation Department, Caltrans document, or any Bay Area Council of Governments document until Oakland said what they wanted. And so Oakland took the first step and built into their specific plan a plan for achieving a different kind of place on what was Interstate 980. Now, it isn't all just about fixing ancient wrongs. Sometimes I tell the story about this fellow here in Stockholm. I go around with a camera a lot and I take pictures. So I was in this frozen day in Stockholm, Sweden. And I saw outside my hotel this beautiful street with the rows of trees. And I thought, well, okay, go take a picture, even if it's a gray and snowy day. And it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I went out there, it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm from Miami, that was a real challenge. I got set up to take a picture, and I saw this fellow in the distance approaching me on his bike. So I took a knee and I waited, with my lens up, just waiting for the moment when he would come to the right place in the frame. But as he got closer to me, I realized something. I realized he was whistling. He was whistling. Now this was now 5:10, 5:15 in the afternoon, and he's an office worker in Stockholm who's on his way home on his afternoon commute. And because somebody drew 2 lines on a map and marked them off and planted those trees in rows at regular spacing, he was having the time of his life. His commute home was now the best part of his day. He was whistling. Now, how many people on our continent are in their evening commute after a stressful day at work, having the best part of their day as they make their way home in traffic? Not enough of us. So the kind of neighborhoods we need are more functional, but there's something else. They also inspire us. They should be convenient, shorten our trips, and they should make it easier for us to do the right thing with regard to staying physically active. They should be full of valuable real estate that supports the tax base. But the most important one here might be make it inspiring. If we make it a place where people want to be, we'll be better off. So we spend a lot of time drawing in a practice like ours. I hope you do in yours, trying to visualize what that better street scene would look like. And then we flip that over and say, now how does it physically, technically work? One of the kinds of things you'll discover is that slower is better than faster. To make that scene work, we need for the design speed of the road and the operational speed of drivers in that corridor to be slow. Why do I care so much about that? Because a little increase in speed generates a huge amount of increase in mayhem. This has gone up, actually. The 80% at 40 miles an hour, maybe more like 85 or 90% now because the vehicles all got taller fairly recently. So that's, when an old school sedan struck you at waist high, you're thrown over the vehicle and maybe through the windshield. When a taller vehicle like the new big GMC trucks and the Yukon and Suburban and so on strikes you higher on your body, you go under the vehicle. So it's sorry to be so grim, but we have to talk about that a little bit. It's why the statistics are so bad. So we want people to go out into public space. They have to feel safe. There are a number of things that they need. And hopefully we're designing it so that it feels like a natural thing to do what our bodies want to do, which is move, walk around upright on 2 legs. I saw this senior citizen lady walking along the sidewalk here. This is a neighborhood we designed in Davidson, North Carolina. And I was out taking pictures of it, and I saw her there, so I stopped and talked to her. And I didn't tell her that we had designed the neighborhood because I didn't want to bias her answer, but I just asked her, what do you think of the neighborhood? And she pointed to the trees, which weren't much more than saplings at that time. She pointed to those trees. She said, those trees are my lifeline. Because those trees are there, I get out of my house, out of my townhouse, and I walk around the blocks in the neighborhood every afternoon. And because of those trees, I get out of my house and I walk around the blocks and I know my kids, not neighbors' kids. I know what time they get home from school. And they know my name, and I know their names. And sometimes when they're on the stoop, they ask me to help them on with their homework. It was amazing. She was just making connection after connection after connection for the little thing of adding street trees, changing the lives of everybody at a whole bunch of ages, interests, and incomes, and so on. So that's me. I'm a bike commuter these days. I ride my bike to work. And I have the same experience that the Stockholm guy does for most of my ride. I do have a harrowing, terrible, stressful part that I'm hoping one of y'all will fix at some point. Now, if you want to know what's going on in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, on Washington Avenue, you go talk to the mayor of Washington Avenue, which is this guy. He sits there every day. And so people come up to him and talk to him about the news of the neighborhood and what's going on. He's not really the mayor. He's just the mayor of Washington Avenue. But there's an interaction that goes on. I observed it going on. A lot of people recognize him. The little detail is that that bench is positioned there on the street perpendicular to the curb. If it was bolted to the sidewalk the other way around, where he was staring at the side of a parked car on the on-street parking space, or even staring at the storefront, then people wouldn't make that eye contact with him as they're going up and down the street, and probably wouldn't stop and have that interaction. Turns out these interactions are really good for our brains. You may have heard of Susan Pinker, who's done the best job of popularizing a huge study. There's a TED Talk on this. They got together a gigantic cohort, many tens of thousands of Americans in midlife. And they asked them all kinds of questions about themselves, about their lives, about their daily habits. They got all their answers, they recorded them, they filed it away, and they waited 10 years. And then they went back, as Susan says, 10 years later to see who was still breathing. And all the ones that were still alive, they asked them questions. And they looked for, knowing that correlation and causation are not the same thing, they still looked for correlations between their answers to the questionnaire and what might have changed or not changed in their lifestyles and the fact that they were still alive. And what they found was very interesting. Some of the things you'd expect, like the ones who had high blood pressure and took their medicine were more likely to live, or the ones who lost a little weight or did a little more exercise or cut down on alcohol and tobacco. But the top two factors are the most interesting and most correlated by far. The second from the top is the people you know. That's your friends and your network of friends and family. So if you have, you're sick one day, somebody notices that you didn't show up, or if you ask a neighbor, they'll bring you some chicken soup. These are the people that you know, your friends, network of friends and family, and a strong network of friends and family is a powerful aid to longevity in an aging nation. But the number one factor at the top is people you do not know. These are people who you say good morning to, and you make eye contact with them. And they say good morning back, and you walk past each other. Or maybe you don't know their name, but they know yours because you're at the coffee shop and they wrote your name on a coffee cup and then they hand it to you. So, but that is a really powerful thing, and it can't really occur when we're behind the wheel. It can only occur when we're moving around. Now, a similar study, 250,000 Medicare recipients in my home county, Miami-Dade County. And they did a similar study of all of them and all of their attributes. And they regularized the statistics for adjusting for economic status. Screening out the effect of greater wealth. And what they found was that the people who lived on blocks with more green, like street trees and yards and green in the backyard and tree in the backyard, that kind of thing, that they had incredibly better health outcomes. They had less heart disease, they had and hypertension, they had lower levels of early onset diabetes, they even had less incidence of Alzheimer's in this population that had a lot of greenness. So that makes you think that maybe we should be designing cities. After all, we shall pass such laws as necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare for public health, designing cities for public health. And so there's a lot to be done. We unearthed a plan by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. for the town of Lake Wales for planting street trees on all their streets, and brought that back and got that reinstituted. You want to see that again? Before, after? Those are the existing and proposed trees. He proposed that prescription for better public health in 1926. And they had implemented some of it, and they had lost some of what they had implemented, but they're back on track now. And then we looked around at the buildings. In terms of design for social interaction, this is not an award winner. So we said, well, what if we simply restored it to what's underneath all that stucco they fortified it with, and put the storefront back? And once you start thinking this way, this before and after way, you can see so many places where a little thing would make a big difference. What if in this spot we were to peel back some of the extra asphalt that we really don't need? Make the world a little more spongy, get a little more greenness, have a little less flooding, have a little less water quality problems. Where can we do these things? Where would we find land, Victor, to build a car optional and better neighborhood? It's all around us. What about the aging and dying shopping centers, for example? So many on so many corridors. Do you hear me, Chesterfield County? Do you hear me, Henrico County? I'm talking to you. I mean, how many dead malls do we have in this country? Thousands of dead and dying malls, and all of them are eligible for some degree of suburban retrofit. Now, this fellow who's at a bus bench would be identified by my friend Dr. Dick Jackson as a candidate for showing up in an emergency room later in the day. And Dr. Jackson would say, when he gets to the emergency room, they're going to diagnose him with something like heat stroke or dehydration, right? What he really has is street tree deficiency syndrome. I did this wrong. I took his picture first, and then I asked him, may I take your picture? You're supposed to do it the other way around. But when I spoke to him, he turned to me, and a big grin came across his face. And you see how his mood just prior to that. It was like everything changed about the day for him that was pretty uncomfortable, stressful, and sweaty, because another human being actually noticed that he was alive in this space. So in designing places, you should be trying to build in the places where that kind of casual interaction can happen, where somebody's not going to die of heat stroke because you designed the place wrong. So to summarize this, what I'm talking about is the spaces between the buildings and not necessarily the land uses, what the urbanists call the public realm. Now, this is the public realm on an ordinary street in Paris, by Parisian standards, pretty ordinary buildings. This is the public realm on an important street next to the campus in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Just real quick flash here, pop quiz, where would you prefer to live? Where would you prefer to walk? Where would you prefer to eat outside? Where would you prefer to meet a friend? Now, I do have to point out this picture. Remember our wildlife biologist who's observing species? Never seen any species in the wild that resembles the one in the picture, but. So to help deal with this, I began to realize that it was street design that was the biggest deficit. I'm convinced as a practitioner that street design is the one thing we can least afford to get wrong, and it's the one thing that we get wrong most often. So as I move into talking about the ingredients of a car optional neighborhood, I have to talk about streets. My buddy John Massengale and I wrote a big fat book on street design, and we're coming out with a new edition. So in the new edition, there's a catalog of essential street types. And it's set up so that you can actually compare them, and we took 10 basic types of streets and then devised pictures of 28 variations on them. And so in the catalog, they go kind of like this. They have these pictures of our computer models of the typical street, sometimes based on a historical example, usually, set up in pairs, with labels and basic features and things like that. And then since we had these computer models we used to create the still images in the book, we animated them. So you can use the ebook and click on it, or you can go to the website. It's street.design, and you can see an animation of each of the street types. And this isn't the only way you would design it. There's let 1,000 flowers bloom. There are many alternatives for each of these things, but these illustrate ways you could do some of that. And it starts with wide streets, and even though those are rare, but look at Broad Street. It turned out that the right way to do road diet in Broad Street was to recapture part of the land in the middle of the right-of-way for the bus rapid transit system. Time-honored move. Now, why would something like retrofitting transit make a difference? I'm going to give you an example. This is Florida International University, and they briefly had a bridge that goes across Southwest 8th Street, or Highway 41. And you can see from the rendering, it's a pretty darn big road. Looks like a road designed for happy motoring. So they, with great pomp and enthusiasm, they went on to the campaign to build the pedestrian bridge. Do you know this story? Because what happened next is kind of ugly. Accelerated bridge construction is a technique you can use to build a prefabricated bridge faster so that the disruption to traffic flowing down below lasts less long. So in order to keep the motoring public motoring freely with less disruption while they built this piece of infrastructure, they accelerated the construction, and I think they accelerated it a little bit too much. And 6 people died, another person maimed for life. It's awful. So they looked into this, and everybody kept saying, well, the pedestrian bridge was built carelessly and too fast. The pedestrian bridge. And after a while, I began to think, it's not a pedestrian bridge. I mean, there it is, kind of ghosted in. It's a bridge for keeping motorists moving, for keeping that rushing river of cars moving without disruption. It's really not for pedestrians. In fact, to use it as a pedestrian, you got to walk a quarter mile out of your way to get up on the thing and go up ramps and stairs and elevators or whatever with you or you and your bike to go across it and then reverse that process on the other side. So it's actually pretty anti-pedestrian as an idea. Now, why would they do such a thing? Like, first of all, how did this road metastasize in the first place? Why would they make it so darn big? And the reason is because a whole lot of people are going that direction in the morning from their homes to their workplaces, and a whole lot of those same people are going the other direction in the evening. So they just added lanes to try and get that free-flowing condition, instead of using that expensive, taxpayer-funded land to build something that was actually scalable. Instead of just filling up with cars and frustration, you could add more trains or more buses and get more and more trips year after year. And then you would have room, if it was a transit and driving balance, for street trees and bike paths off protected bike lanes, sidewalks that are shaded by trees, and if you really wanted it, a pedestrian bridge. But the bridge would be basically extra at that point because human beings would be able to move around safely at grade as a result. You could do that with rubber tires, you could do that with rails. I guess you know what I'm about to tell you. It's 2024, and with great pomp and celebration, they've just started the reconstruction of the second pedestrian bridge instead of the transit that I just described. So these street types are important. We need to relearn how to make grand avenues and boulevards that are designed to balance local needs and cross-town movement if we're ever to fix that sort of problem. Meanwhile, there are a lot of other kinds of streets, like main streets. Here's the main streets illustrated there. So I'll show you one. Panama City, this is Harrison Avenue in Panama City, Florida, and the Panhandle. You may remember headlines about Hurricane Michael hitting Panama City very badly, damaged the place a lot. It really was hard on the town. And you can see in the picture boarded up storefronts and things. Hurricane Michael was in October of 2018. I shot this picture in July of 2018. This boarded up storefront, desolate dystopian scene is not the result of the hurricane's damage. It's the result of a 50-year slow motion catastrophe of decline in the town. But they, inspired by the need to recover from the hurricane and with a lot of support from the state and federal governments, have really made an amazing investment in the last 5 years to turn themselves around. So Harrison Avenue is a completely different street now with a whole lot less asphalt and a whole lot more room for walking and a whole lot more trees. And it's sort of easier on the eye appearance. I think the measure of success is when parents are dining at the cafe or the brewery and their kids are drawing on chalk in the street. And that tells us then that there's not much fear because the street's been slowed down. If you are a unicyclist, this is where you go. There's a plaza. This is not really a modern roundabout, although the car movements are like in a roundabout. It's a plaza. When it's closed to traffic, it feels like just another public space. It's mostly open to traffic. There's a clock in the center of it. And it turns out now, every time the morning news program wants to do a live shot from Panama City, they go there because people recognize the town clock that was installed in the center. It's turned, as you can see on the right, it's turned into the most Instagrammed spot in greater Panama City. People want to stage the Abbey Road crosswalk stunt, they go do it there. And I have a big collection, and increasingly larger collection of wedding photographs made on Harrison Avenue. Trust me, for the 50 years prior to 2018, there was nobody getting their wedding photographs made on that street. So this idea of a bigger menu of street types, skinny ones and wide ones, recovering alleys, recovering the American garden streets, rethinking how we use the space. Maybe we have room in some cases for 3 tree lines instead of 2. What about broad streets? You have a broad street. Originally, a town would have a main street, which was relatively narrow and the scene of bustle and commerce, and a broad street, which was the market town road. Like in Oxford, there's High Street and Broad Street. And a broad street is a time-honored time. There's the Dutch. They're very clever. This is called a Fietsstraat, bike street. Fiets means bikes. It's not divided into 2 with 1 lane in each direction. It's divided into 3, and the middle part is a rough texture. What that means is there are cars and there is parking. But if they want to, they can't get all 4 tires on smooth pavement very easily for much of the time. So if they want to pass somebody on a bike, they have to do it at the bike pace. So it's a bike-paced street, pretty clever thing. Turns out we aren't allowed to build that street in America for no good reason. But we are allowed to do some things like protected bike lanes. This is Western Ave in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they ended up getting the best new bike lanes in America and got the headline for that as well. So skinny streets, streets with bike stuff, streets with street trees. How about row house streets like we know so commonly here in Richmond, or streets in a suburban village that might be asymmetrical and with homes really close together. Or as we adapt to climate change, what about canal streets? The menu, the standard menu among transportation engineers is local, collector, and arterial. That's 3 streets on the menu. There should be 1,000 streets on the menu. They also sometimes talk about context. They have 2 contexts. There's urbanizing, by which they mean suburban, and there's rural, by which they also mean suburban. So if we're going to adapt to climate change in coastal communities, we need streets like canal streets. It turns out we can do that and add a lot of value. And that has been demonstrated pretty powerfully in this example from Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. The neighborhood is called Ion, that Dean mentioned in her introduction. And unlike historic Charleston, which has all sorts of charm for 300 years, and the beach out here, which has views of the ocean, Ion is just an ordinary piece of real estate in the town. What's interesting is that the real estate on either side is comparable land uses. And what you're looking at is vertical spikes that go higher when the property tax revenue per acre is higher. If you're the city manager or the mayor and you're trying to balance the budget or put tires on a school bus or fix the roof on the building in the park, you need some spikes to pay for those things. And that's what they managed to prove there. Why do I think this is so urgent that we resurrect a bigger menu of street types? Because we're fixing American cities. This is Syracuse, when we take Interstate 81 out and put back Almond Street. That's the plan, by the way. New York State DOT is building this. They're taking the interstate out and putting back in that great boulevard. We need the menu that includes more than just what the DOT had before. And it could not be more urgent. This is what they have now. Chunks of it falling each day, of course, and what they will have after they restore it. Main streets I talked about, I'll just give you an example of how dramatically different a street makeover can be for a car optional neighborhood. Here's the street before and after. They had widened it again and made it one way, trying to get people out of the downtown to the suburbs fast at the end of a workday. And now they've turned it into a skinny, slow, curbless, shaded street that's shared. If they can do that in West Palm Beach, we can do that in the Commonwealth. Now, I mentioned I would show car-free places, and there are some incredible experiments going on. And like a lot of experiments in urban form, this one is occurring in a holiday town, a place where people go for vacation. This is in Costa Rica. This is the one I asked you about at lunch, Lauren. The Las Catalinas is what it's called. Charles Brewer, an American who was the founder of Mindspring.com, if the tech folks remember that company. He became an urbanist developer, and he's built a car-free town. The beach town is the first phase of Las Catalinas. And to date, they're at 20% full-time residential, and the rest are visitors. Their goal is to get to 40%. So their business is vacations and holidays. But I love the idea of a walkable city here for two reasons. One is all the people who go visit it will go home and say, why can't we just do that in our own neighborhood? And that might help us get to more walkable cities. The other is that their stated goal was to make it a kid-friendly town. Like the number one reason why the cars are pushed to the edge of Las Catalinas is so the kids can be free-range kids. Here's some of the new developments designed very beautifully by architects Valle and Valle for Las Catalinas. So see, what happens is once you're free of the idea of having to store all the cars inside the town and move all the cars next to every building, you can create intimate spaces that are elusive. And in the process, use real estate that's very hard to use otherwise, like this steep slope. So, here's on our continent. This is the relatively suburban part of Phoenix, Tempe, and a development called Cul-de-sac Tempe, an unfortunate name. But this is a car-free rental apartment neighborhood. And they have a little bit of commercial parking on the far edge next to the brewery. But other than that, like in the middle of it, there are no cars at all. It's quite beautiful, actually. It was intended from the beginning to feel kind of like what you saw in Las Catalinas, but with regular people, not holiday visitors, who go to work each day on the light rail that's adjacent. So installing transit unlocked the possibility of such a neighborhood. And of course, this is the desert, so these really skinny spaces that stay shaded most of the time by the buildings themselves is pretty important. And I'll end with one more Chattanooga thing, which is to give you the recipe for a car-optional neighborhood. First, we have to bring things closer together by design. That means getting that practical mixed use in in-town locations. Want to see that again? Before, after. So they're building Chattanooga's first 21st century car-optional neighborhood at the Bend. And that means achieving livable density, getting to enough other souls around to support local commerce and make things work. Number two, designing slow, safe, walkable, bikeable streets. That's baked into this one. Number three, as Jane Jacobs would recommend, lay out small blocks in an interconnected web pattern. There's plenty of parking in the Bend. It's just in the middle of the block and under buildings and in garages and on streets instead of in a bunch of surface parking lots. Number four, require street-oriented, street-shaping architecture. That means doors and windows facing the street, not blank walls and garage doors. And match those up with green, comfortable public spaces. The anatomy of a street-oriented building is not hard to figure out. You have thousands of them in Richmond. You don't need a textbook. You can find them here in Richmond or in Old Town Alexandria, as on the right. And part of what they're blending in is places to do things other than work and sleep, like places to be entertained and go to school. Number five, plant street trees and then plant some more. And then plant some more after that. Number six, high quality bike infrastructure. This actually completes a big piece of the Tennessee River Park bike trail and then connects every street in the neighborhood to it and to more. Number seven, I'm finally going to talk about a gadget optimized for new mobility, like ride hailing, bike share, scooters, car share, electric vehicles, autonomous and connected vehicles, delivery bots. We have a lot of those in Miami now. And whatever's next, because we don't know what's next. So you got to figure that there's going to be constant innovation in that space. But the menu is growing in terms of what kind of vehicle you use. I ask a lot of young people questions, and when I get back constantly is, they just want to go where they want to go when they want to go there. Doesn't care. It isn't about hating cars or wanting necessarily to use a scooter to do it or whatever. What if we didn't need so much parking? This is for you, Lauren, because you were in Brickell. Brickell Avenue in Miami is the densest residential neighborhood south of Manhattan, but if you stand on the platform at the Brickell Avenue Metro Rail station and you look out at eye level, almost everything you can see is parking. I think it might really be parking-oriented development. So number 8 is right-size the parking. We need some, let's have some, but just the right amount, not too much. Number 9, this might surprise you, plan for showers and covered secure bike parking at workplaces. Should be basic. It's the 21st century. Put a shower in your office building. You might be surprised by how many people are more inclined to get a run in at lunch or to walk to work or to take a bike ride. And the 10th, develop around transit. Here's a picture of a transit-connected mobility hub where you can get to things in the region using the transit system, but you can also get to things in the neighborhood with bike share or scooter or your own bike or what have you. So altogether, this is Victor's 10-part recipe for how to grow a car optional neighborhood. Final admonition is about working together. Vince Graham, developer of the neighborhood called Ion that I showed you, all the red spikes in South Carolina, says if you sell isolation, like people living on the cul-de-sac behind, focused on their backyard, not their front, then every time you add something, it takes away from what you're selling. This explains why in real estate development it's a given that the people in phase 1 will turn out to oppose phase 4. Okay? But if you sell community, then every time we add something, it makes it more complete and adds to what you're selling. Thank you very much.
You want to moderate some questions? Do you have time for questions?
Yeah, if you do.
No,
You want to moderate?
no, you go.
Okay, all right, I'm going to randomly pick because I don't know very many of you. Questions? Challenges? Victor, what makes you think? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name's Joe. The question I have has to do with the financing around parking. So in Richmond, yes, we removed parking minimums, which is great, but we're still getting feedback from developers saying, well, the bank that's financing the development is requiring parking.
Oh, yeah.
How do we rejigger the financial system that's actually development?
That's a great question. For those of you who might not have been able to hear, the question is about financing of parking. Even if you repeal, like in Richmond, minimum parking requirements, don't the banks still require a bunch of parking spaces? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, think of the reasons why you put parking, or that you choose the amount of parking that you're going to have. The first one would be because the tenant demands it, like it's the actual need, right? That's the first. The second one would be because government demands it. It's in the zoning, or it was in your town, and in a lot of others, that we should have, X parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of whatever use. And the problem with that is, of course, that the bank doesn't want to, if your project fails, they don't want to take your property back and not be able to sell it to somebody else because it's inherently flawed, doesn't work, right? So they tend to be conservative about parking. But of all of those 3 groups, the tenants, the bankers, and the government, it's always the government that insists on more parking. And if you get the government out of that decision and let the market do it, they will try to conserve costs and maximize revenues. And the way to do that is to have just enough parking but not too much. The second tool that they can use, and many developers now are doing this, is to unbundle the rent for the office or the apartment from the rent for the parking spaces. So then as a householder, you might say, honey, do we really need 2 parking spaces? They're going to cost us an extra $375 a month each. And that's a great inducement to say, you work at home anyway. We never use that second car. What are we doing? $12,000 a year going down the drain, and we also have to pay rent for the parking space for it. The next thing you know, that person will rent only 1 parking space instead of 2. So I think this is a place where the market will at times get it wrong, but they'll more often get it right than government will. Next question? Yes, sir.
Speaking of market demand, a lot of times we see new developments going up, even in mixed-use cases, and the developers building very large business spaces with the intent of selling it out to a large national corporation where they can get a 10, 20-year lease. And a lot of the images you're showing here are these beautiful streets and small businesses that look like fun new places to try.
it's a challenge every single time, and if you figure it out, I want you to bottle it and sell it. I don't want to minimize the challenge you just described. I think one of the things you can do is try to really build on local strengths. So like in Oakland, for example, they pivoted from a focus on the developers of the downtown office buildings and their needs, or the what have you, to the needs of the creative people in Oakland that were driving the thriving, inventive art scene and cultural scene. And they said, we have to figure out through public policy levers how to promote more of the stuff we want and less of the stuff we don't. So that was an example of them just looking around and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this drum circle and maybe these mural artists and maybe these nonprofits are very healthy. And you got to understand the Bay Area's real estate conditions are very volatile and odd, but it was so cutthroat that as rents rose in San Francisco, eventually that beloved and vaunted and wonderful nonprofit, the Sierra Club, founded by John Muir and all the good guys at the Sierra Club, jumped across the bay and displaced 7 small local nonprofits that were paying lower rent by bidding up on the same real estate space. So the nonprofits are even predatory in this kind of thing, in that rapidly changing environment. So anyway, I would just suggest that the answer is going to be different in each place. But the first thing to do is really look at what's there. Like, see how you could leverage existing strengths. It could be talent in the local talent pool that knows how to do something, like weld something or bake something or paint something. Or it could be the natural environment. There's towns in Central Florida, for example, that unlike most of Florida, are not flat. They have a lot of up and down, and people like to go there to train for runners and bikers and triathletes will go there to train on hills. So they said, okay, let's rename ourselves Cradle of Champions. So I guess what I'm getting at is if you build your economic development plan and then your real estate arguments out of existing local distinctiveness. That's my advice. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I guess going off of that same question, I love like all these before and afters with the beautiful street scenes, but I can't help but like.
I didn't show you the ugly ones.
I just can't help but like feel like if I was there, I would be struck with the like sense of the gentrification.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm just curious, like as an urban planning student, what, in your experience, the best way to implement this great design is without raising rent prices, kicking out people living there, and really only going to benefit the wealthy.
Now we could do a semester on this, so I'm just going to start it. But the question is really just, is all this just stalking horse for gentrification? Or how do you address the threat of rents rising faster than incomes and people feeling displaced because their taxes are going up, but not their wages? I think there's a whole group of things. One of the first ones is to recognize that as a society, if you want mixed income and affordable housing, you have to build your policy and your budget around that idea. I'm saying you have to pay for it. And we are in a highly regulated consumer capitalist society that does certain things that the providers or the business people don't really want to do, but they are required to do. And zoning is one of those tools. Seat belts are among those tools. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay, you get the comparison? All right, so if what you want is mixed income development, then you don't use up all your incentives on other things and you incentivize that heavily. And maybe you spend money. So Arlington County here in Virginia has been a leader in interesting ways. There are 100 different ways to combine capital and public support and policy to get additional mixed income housing on Columbia Pike. In the rest of Arlington, there's probably only 7 ways. But that's because they made a conscious effort to get that to happen as a public objective. So I think that's really kind of a starting place, because a lot of communities, and maybe even some of the surrounding counties here, have a reputation for not being into it, not being excited about affordable housing or mixed income. I mean, why don't they just live somewhere else? That's a prevailing attitude in many of the suburbs, and might be reflected in some of the darker episodes in our national politics. So I think the first place to start is to say we're designing for everyone and we want to include everyone, so we're going to think ahead about the vulnerable population in policy. Next, of course, if there's only one good street in a whole town or one neighborhood that's highly desirable in the most favored quadrant and everybody wants to be there, the prices are going to be higher there because it's a scarce product. Remember the law of supply and demand again? So we have to fight scarcity with plenty by having there be 20 or 200 such neighborhoods. And there's an infinite number of places we could get creative about doing it, whether it's an old shopping center that doesn't have any housing on it at all, for example. So there's that. And then I think as we combat prices, one of the most powerful or potent problems in the math for housing is land cost. So if you can only build a handful of units on that square of land, then the per unit land cost is going to be high for each one. But if you can build more densely and get more units, then the per unit land cost can go down, even as the underlying price of the land goes up with the zoned in value. So rehabilitating the reputation of denser development requires design. If you just have more people and it's just more crowded, then that's not going to make it more desirable. You have to have more people but still feel charming and have privacy and think about sound issues that happen when we all live closer together. So I think anyway, let's do the rest of the semester on displacement. Gentrification is a funny word that, it's kind of a cultural, it's a word that means a lot of different things to different people, but displacement is really the problem. If we could figure out more ways to add new populations without displacing the people who are already there, then now we're getting at it, right? Gentrification is just means prices went up. That's by itself not the indicator we need. I will also say that as you think about housing cost, think about housing and transportation cost as a composite number. Housing plus transportation. There's even a thing at the Center for Neighborhood Technology called the H+T index. You can look that up for every census tract in America. But if housing prices are rising, and even though you might be pulling all the policy levers you can pull and spending money and doing everything you can to work against that rising housing price, if you're doing nothing to expand the menu of affordable transportation, then you're blowing it, because the transportation cost is a big chunk of household income that could be recovered and used toward higher housing costs to offset the problem. 1,900 Americans spent between 1% and 3% of their household budget on transportation, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. 1% to 3% of the household budget. Now we spend, according to AAA, $12,000 per car per year. So if you have to have a car per person, you might be spending, depending on your household income, 30, 40, 50, more than half of your household income on cars. And then you wonder why you don't have enough income left over to pay for rent. The problem is the cars. I saw your hand. What's your name?
My name is Angelina.
Angelina.
So how do you convince legislators? Oh, sorry. How do you convince legislators to change the development? In what ways do you think that they could be persuaded into putting budget into?
So I think you have to know who the legislators are. A lot of them are motivated by fiscal arguments. So we might be out here tempted to talk to developers or to legislators and say, let me show you all these cool things you could do. It'll help with all these social and cultural and ecological benefits. But what you really need to do is say, how would you like to turn your revenue around and spend less and bring more in to solve the problems day to day? So a developer would say, how would you like to say, make more money rather than less, but spend less to make it, and maybe even be the good guy and the good gal instead of the bad guy in this circumstance. And they lean forward and say, how do I do that? And I would say, well, I have to show you, you have to meet all these social and cultural and ecological objectives. With legislators, at the state level, there's some interesting innovation happening, even in extremist right-wing governments like Florida's or left-wing governments like California's, state preemptive legislation is interfering now a little bit with local sovereignty and slapping the wrists of misbehaving municipalities and saying they have to get out of the way of abundant housing. So that's not a right or left thing. I mean, California versus Florida, you can see both of them doing the same things to deal with that. But I'm wary of the state legislatures reaching in to remove local sovereignty, because that means it's people you don't know, making decisions for the whole state instead of people you might actually be able to go have a meeting with or go to a meeting and speak at the podium to. So that's an issue. There's this, so since we wouldn't dare use Virginia for this, I will tell you a North Carolina story. A lawyer in North Carolina told me a couple of months ago, he said, Victor, there is this widely held belief that once a year, in time for the general session, the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina will convene in Raleigh to do the people's business. But what they are really there to do is to screw their enemies and reward their friends. So you have to step back. I mean, that's very cynical. I was shocked to hear him say it. It took me a while to process it. But I think you have to step back and say, what are their motivations? And their motivations might be different depending on who you're talking to. But on housing, in particular, since the previous question was about gentrification, there is some interesting alignment going on between far left and far right. They're teaming up because the left doesn't like the lack of inclusion and the right doesn't like interfering with property rights. And they're finding common ground and adopting legislation I would have never expected decades earlier. But I guess ask yourself first, who are they? What do they care about? And then build the argument. Did we get one from this side?
I'm not sure in a medium-sized city like Richmond, for instance, I'm not sure the argument about market forces dictating parking requirements really works well.
Might not be enough.
We have a very poorly developed public transportation system, and there's a lot of building going on, a lot of apartments, and I don't know of any project since the Richmond City Council adopted the no parking rule that is building less than 0.8 to 1.25 parking spaces per apartment. Because that's what people want.
Right, but if they repealed a rule that was requiring 2.5 parking spaces per unit, and the developers are now doing 0.8 or 1.25, progress has just been made in the direction of not wasting land and space. I appreciate you saying that. I think it will depend everywhere you go. And there are places where minimum parking requirements don't matter at all because developers want to build more parking than is required. In Baton Rouge, IBM built a big office building and required significantly more parking spaces for their executives in the new downtown Baton Rouge IBM office building than the local government even required in their rules. And I was a little surprised by that. So I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, we don't want to live here. And they pointed to the map of the neighborhood like this. We don't want to live here. And I thought to myself, well, that's where Baton Rouge needs to focus their effort. Repealing minimum parking requirements wouldn't solve that problem. But making that circle on the map a place where people would really want to be would help. And that's what they should focus on. So we don't want to think about minimum parking requirement repeals as a magical cure-all. There's a whole lot more to do, including just rebooting or pressing the reset button on your whole town building culture. Architecture, real estate, regulation, all of it. Why not? Indeed.
I was wondering, do you believe having a public shuttling system between puddings and takeouts would be a feasible option to save time for people?
That is a really specific question. I love it though. And that's eyeballing that was one of the reasons why we thought Mayo Island needed to have significant public space instead of just becoming another mixed mid-rise housing or development project rising out of that island. So the question was, will the shuttle work? Well, I can tell you that on the Upper Arkansas River in Chaffee County, Colorado, where they have people whitewater rafting and kayaking all the time, that they do exactly what you described. Basically it's a constant circulation of craft, larger and smaller, going downriver, and then vehicles that can take their kayak and their gear going back up and they do that whenever the water is white. And then they switch around. Those same businesses that operate that operate something similar for snowmobiles during the cold part of the year. So if they can do it in Chaffee County, Colorado, which is a remote place with a tiny population that in the early 2000s would have 13 or 14 building permits per year in the whole county, more now, then you can do it in Richmond.
We got time for one more question.
Yes, ma'am? Green.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm your student. When you brought up Oakland, I really thought about like the houseless population. In planning in general, and this is probably another semester-long question, so don't feel the need to answer the whole thing. But how are we like planning spaces for houseless populations and not like essentially gentrifying?
Sure.
Moving them out of where they just have to exist.
And you know, a textbook book worth reading would be to Google the comments of former Mayor Libby Schaff in Oakland about this exact issue, because I learned a lot from her about it. And we walked around the tent camps together when working on the downtown plan with neighbors and the stakeholders and the folks from the neighborhood, the creative groups I talked about, leaders in Chinatown. So we walked around the homeless camps. And so first of all, being homeless is not a crime, despite the popularity of jackbooted thug policies of driving people out of public spaces. It's not illegal to be unhoused. And so, but some local governments are very heavy-handed when it comes to homeless people. And I think that that reflects poorly on us as Americans. So I want to say that first. In some locations, it has become strategically useful to identify an area where a tent camp is tolerated. And then there are areas in the Bay Area, not just in Oakland, but in Berkeley as well, that have had tent encampments on them for decades. And that's not looking the other way or acting, nonchalant about the rules. It's just a reality that there's a large population that's not going to be able to get into a house. Then I think we've seen a lot of success from coordination between nonprofits and faith-based groups and local government acting in concert rather than individually in some locations, and those coalitions have done some good. Salt Lake City is an interesting one to study as well. In Salt Lake, so if you don't know this, Salt Lake City in Utah, very conservative place. It's like one of the brightest red parts of the red map, right? So they don't just build their public policies day to day routinely out of compassion. I'm just going to throw that out there. So you got to understand the context. But in Salt Lake City, of all places, they finally figured out that the best solution for a growing homeless population was to just give them homes. They set up transitional housing, small houses, cottages, emergency housing, a whole suite of things, including some of it that's quite well designed and dignified, worthy of replication. And they get people out of the cycle of homelessness that are willing to do so. And that's not everybody that's in the unhoused population wants to do anything other than what they're doing, but a lot of people do. And I think that if Salt Lake City, with its conservative fiscal approach to everything, can figure out that the best thing to do is to get the homeless in homes, then I bet we could repeat that in many places in the country.
Thank you, Victor. So thank you all for coming out today. We do have student sign out sheets here at the front if you want to, as you exit. I really appreciate you all coming out today, and this concludes our lecture.